I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived
Yes,
in
I
Guatemala
arrived in
on the
Guatemala.
Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Where did I arrive?
In Guatemala. I arrived in
Right.
Guatemala.
I arrived in Guatemala.
Yes.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
Me, AJ. I
Me,
arrived
AJ.
in Guatemala on the
I
Day of
arrived
the Dead,
in Guatemala
November
on the
1st.
Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I didn't
No,
arrive
I
in
didn't
Guatemala
arrive in
on the
Guatemala
Day of the Dead,
on November
No.
3rd.
November
I
3rd.
arrived in Guatemala
Yes.
on November 1st.
Yes. It's a November 1st.
What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st. I arrived in
November 1st.
Guatemala
I arrived in
on
Guatemala
the Day of the Dead,
on
November 1st.
1st. Where did I arrive on
In,
November 1st?
in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala
right.
on the
I
Day
arrived
of
in
the
Guatemala
Dead, November
on
1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Oh.
I was curious about this holiday,
Oh.
so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Oh.
Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry
No, I wasn't angry
about this
about
holiday.
this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday.
I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious
Yes,
about
I was
this
curious
holiday.
about this holiday.
Who was curious about this holiday?
Me, AJ. I was
I was
curious
AJ.
about this
I
holiday.
was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
The day cemetery.
Holiday.
The holiday.
I was
I
curious,
was curious
about
about
the holiday.
this holiday.
Which holiday was I curious
The Day
about?
of the Dead. I was curious
Which
about
holiday
the Day
was
of
I
the Dead.
curious about? The Day of the Dead.
Yes, the Day
I
of
was
the Dead.
curious
I
about
was curious
the Day
about this
of the Dead.
the Day of the Dead.
Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Of course.
Of course.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So, I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Ah.
Where did I go?
I go to the cemetery to see what's happening.
I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
Cemetery. I went to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Me, AJ. I went to cemeteries.
I went to the cemetery. Where did I go? To
Cemeteries.
the cemetery. Right. I
went to the cemeteries.
When did I go to the cemetery?
November 1st. I went to
November
the
1st,
cemetery
the Day
on
of the Dead.
November 1st.
I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
I went to the cemeteries to see
To
what's
see
happening.
what was happening.
What was happening?
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Ah,
Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
me, AJ. I was.
Me, AJ,
I went to
the
cemeteries to see what was happening.
Where was the cemetery?
The cemetery is in Guatemala.
In Guatemala.
Yes,
The cemetery
Guatemala.
was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is
A holiday.
a holiday.
The Day of the
The
Dead,
Day of the Dead
is
is
a holiday.
a holiday.
When is the Day of the Dead?
November 1st. The Day of the Dead
November
is
1st.
November
The Day
1st.
of the Dead was and is
Was in.
November 1st.
Okay.
So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to
Oh.
see what was happening.
Oh.
What I found was quite interesting.
Ah.
Was it boring? No,
No, it wasn't boring. It were very
Was it
interesting.
interesting?
Yes, it was
Yes,
interesting.
yes, it
Of
was
course.
interesting. The cemetery was interesting.
Mm.
How did I feel
I felt
about
very
the cemetery?
interesting.
I felt it was interesting.
Yes, very
Or I
interesting.
thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
Interesting. It were interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The
The
cemetery
cemetery.
was
The cemetery
interesting.
was interesting.
Yes, of course.
When was the cemetery interesting?
On the Day of the Dead,
It was
cemeteries
interesting
was
on
very
the Day
interesting
of the
on the
Dead.
Day of the Dead,
November
November 1st.